The African arrived at the ranch and he showed me his big tool. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more intense and emotional stories like this to you. I never questioned who I was. 40 years old, a ranch owner, and recently separated after years in a marriage that, in hindsight, never truly made sense. I thought I knew myself. Until he arrived. Malik. The new worker. Mysterious, strong, with a presence that made my skin burn in ways I couldn't explain. I told myself it was nothing. That I was just tired. That I had spent too much time alone. But the way his eyes held mine, the way his deep voice lingered in my thoughts long after he had spoken, I knew this wasn't normal. And when I saw what he was carrying, I realized nothing would ever be the same again. If this story keeps you hooked, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications. Share it with someone who loves intense and passionate stories, and let's dive into this journey together. The sun beat down on the dry land as I watched the truck kick up a cloud of dust, rolling down the dirt road toward the ranch. I had hired plenty of workers over the years, but something about this one unsettled me. Maybe it was the way my chest tightened when I read his name on the paperwork. Malik. Maybe it was just the way the past few months had changed me, left me open in ways I hadn't been before. I didn't know yet, but as soon as he stepped out of the truck, I felt it. He was taller than I expected, built like a man who had spent his whole life working with his hands. His dark skin glistened with sweat from the long drive, and when he set his deep brown eyes on me, something inside my stomach coiled tight. He didn't smile, didn't speak right away, just looked at me like he was taking my measure. I pulled off my hat, wiping my forehead. "You Malik?" "Yes." His voice was low, steady. That slight accent made my skin prickle. I held out my hand, expecting a quick shake, but when his fingers wrapped around mine, they were strong, rough, and lingered just a moment too long. I pulled away fast, clearing my throat. "I'll show you around." We walked side by side through the ranch, my boots crunching against the dry dirt. He carried his bag over one shoulder, his muscles flexing beneath his thin shirt. I forced my eyes forward, my pulse kicking up every time he moved too close. This was ridiculous. We reached the small cabin where he'd be staying, just past the barn. I pushed open the door, stepping aside. "It's basic, but it'll do the job. You got a bed, a bathroom, a place to put your things." He nodded, stepping inside, tossing his bag on the cot. Then, as if he had no shame, he pulled his shirt off over his head, revealing a body carved from pure strength. My throat went dry. I should have looked away. I should have turned and walked out, but my feet were rooted to the ground. He stretched his arms, muscles rippling, then ran a hand over his chest, wiping away the sweat. His eyes flicked to mine, catching me staring. I felt the heat crawl up my neck. "Breakfast is at dawn," I muttered, spinning on my heel before I embarrassed myself further. I barely made it to the barn before I stopped, gripping the wooden post like it could steady me. What the hell was that? I had never looked at a man like that before, not once. But Malik, there was something different, something undeniable. I spent the rest of the day avoiding him. But that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, all I could see was his body, his hands, the way he had looked at me. And deep down, I knew. This was just the beginning. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, hoping to clear my head before seeing him again. The air was crisp, the sky painted with the first hints of sunrise as I walked toward the barn. I needed to focus. There was work to be done. But as soon as I stepped inside, I saw him. Malik stood near the tool rack, lifting a heavy wooden beam onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing.
His muscles tensed, every movement smooth and effortless. The sight sent a pulse of something dangerous through me, something I didn't want to name. I forced myself to keep walking, grabbing a saddle from the wall. "You been up long?" He turned his head, his dark eyes catching the dim morning light. "Since before dawn." I nodded, trying not to let my gaze linger on the way his shirt clung to his chest. "Good. Lots to do." We worked in silence, the only sounds the rustling of hay and the occasional snort of a horse. I kept myself busy, avoiding looking at him for too long, but it was impossible to ignore the way he moved, controlled, steady, like a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. At one point, I reached for a bucket of feed at the same time he did, our hands brushing for just a second. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. Neither did he. His fingers, calloused and strong, lingered against mine just a fraction too long. It was subtle, but the air between us changed. I swallowed hard, pulling back. "You ever work with horses before?" His lips twitched, like he knew exactly what had just happened, but wasn't going to acknowledge it. "A little. I learned fast." I nodded, gripping the bucket tighter than necessary. "Good. We start with the fences after breakfast." I walked off before I could say anything stupid. The day dragged on, each moment filled with an unbearable tension. I caught him watching me more than once, his gaze unreadable, but he never said a word about it. By the time the sun was setting, I was exhausted, not from the work, but from trying to ignore whatever was happening between us. That night, I sat on the porch with a whiskey in hand, staring at the dark horizon. The crickets hummed in the distance, the air thick with heat. I told myself I was just winding down, but when Malik walked up, sweat glistening on his skin from the long day, I knew I had been waiting for him. He stopped at the railing, his eyes locked on mine. "Long day," he said. I took a slow sip of my drink, my pulse pounding. "Yeah." He leaned against the post, his presence overwhelming even in the open air. "You seem tense." I let out a dry laugh, shaking my head. "Lot on my mind." He didn't look away. "Anything I should know about?" There was a challenge in his tone, something quiet but deliberate. My grip tightened around the glass. I should have ended the conversation. I should have gotten up and walked inside. Instead, I looked at him. Really looked at him. His jaw was strong, his lips slightly parted, his chest rising and falling in an easy rhythm. And then he smirked. Like he knew, like he had known all along. My stomach twisted, heat crawling up my spine. This was a game I wasn't ready to play. But something told me Malik was just getting started. The air between us was thick, heavier than the summer heat clinging to my skin. Malik stood there, leaning against the wooden railing, watching me like he was waiting for something. I should have said something. Hell, I should have walked inside. But I didn't. I took another sip of whiskey, the burn doing nothing to calm the fire growing inside me. "You settling in all right?" I finally asked, my voice lower than usual. Malik smirked, his eyes never leaving mine. "Yeah, seems like a good place to work." He tilted his head slightly. "Nice view, too." I exhaled slowly, shifting in my chair. There was no mistaking the way he said it. He wasn't talking about the ranch. I should have shut it down right then. Should have laughed it off, told him to get some rest. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, my mind racing. He moved first, slow, deliberate steps across the porch until he was standing right in front of me. The scent of sweat, earth, and something distinctly him filled my lungs. "Something wrong, boss?" His voice was deep, smooth, but there was something teasing underneath it. I shook my head, gripping the glass tighter. "You should get some sleep. Early morning tomorrow." He didn't move. "You sure that's what you want?" My breath caught. The way he looked at me, it wasn't uncertain, wasn't hesitant. It was knowing. Like he had already seen something in me that I wasn't ready to admit to myself. I could have ended it there. Should have. Instead, I stood up, my body too close to his, heat radiating between us. "You got something to say, Malik?" He let out a soft chuckle, his lips twitching as he looked me up and down. "Not yet." Then, just as easily as he had closed the distance, he stepped back, his smirk lingering as he turned and walked down the steps. I stayed there, watching him disappear into the night, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. I had spent my whole life ignoring these feelings, burying them deep, but Malik had seen me, and worse, I had let him. The next morning I woke up restless. I barely got any sleep, my mind replaying the way Malik had looked at me, the way he had stood too close, the heat that passed between us. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Couldn't mean anything. I had spent 40 years being a man who followed the rules, who never questioned who he was. A wife, a ranch, a life I had built piece by piece. And yet, one night with Malik had shaken something loose inside me, something I wasn't ready to face. I stepped out onto the porch, the crisp morning air hitting my face. The ranch was already alive with the sounds of work, horses moving in the stables, the distant clang of tools. And then, there he was. Malik stood near the barn, his back to me, shirtless, his muscles flexing as he lifted a heavy sack of feed over his shoulder. His skin glowed under the morning sun, sweat already clinging to his body from the early labor. I should have looked away. I didn't. His head turned slightly, as if he could feel me watching. His gaze met mine, a slow, deliberate glance over his shoulder, daring me. My throat went dry. I forced myself to move, to shake off whatever the hell this was. I walked down toward him, keeping my voice even. "How's it coming?" Malik set the sack down, wiping his hands on his jeans before meeting my gaze fully. "Steady. Got the fences patched up, took care of the horses." His lips twitched slightly. "Figured you'd be out earlier." I crossed my arms. "Didn't sleep much." He tilted his head, that knowing look back in his eyes. "Yeah?" I ignored the way my pulse jumped. "Yeah." The silence stretched between us again. The same damn tension from the night before, thick and undeniable. I should have shut it down, walked away, reminded myself who I was. But Malik took a step closer. Not enough to touch, but enough that I could feel his body heat, smell the faint scent of sweat and earth on his skin. My skin burned with it. "You gonna keep pretending?" His voice was low, rough. I swallowed hard. Pretending what? A slow smirk spread across his lips. "That you don't feel it." My stomach clenched. "I don't know what the hell you're talking about." He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You do." I should have walked away, but instead I stood there, letting his words sink into me. And when he reached up, his fingers brushing against the brim of my hat, his knuckles just barely grazing my skin, I didn't move. I didn't stop him. His voice dropped even lower. "Tell me to stop." I should have. I didn't. I didn't say a word. Didn't move. The air between us was thick, the heat of the rising sun nothing compared to the fire burning under my skin. Malik's fingers lingered at the brim of my hat, his knuckles barely brushing against my forehead, but it felt like a brand, like he was testing me, like he already knew the answer before I did. Tell me to stop. I couldn't. His dark eyes searched mine, waiting, daring me to say the words. But I stood there, frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had spent my whole life in control, knowing exactly who I was, what I wanted. But this was something else, something dangerous, something I couldn't name, but felt deep in my bones. Malik let out a slow breath, his lips curving just slightly. Didn't think so. His hand dropped, but he didn't step back. He just stood there, too close, his presence filling every inch of space around me. My chest was tight, my body tense with something I wasn't ready to face. I forced myself to take a step back, to break the moment before I did something I couldn't take back. We got work to do. His smirk deepened, like he knew he had me rattled. Yeah, boss. The rest of the day was torture. I kept my hands busy, threw myself into every chore I could find, but nothing helped. Every time I turned around, I saw him, his muscles flexing as he worked, the way sweat dripped down his neck, the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. Except I was. I couldn't stop. By the time the sun was setting, I was exhausted, but not from the work, from the fight inside me. I needed space, needed air. I grabbed a beer from the kitchen and headed to the barn, leaning against the wooden post as the evening breeze cooled my skin. I took a long sip, closing my eyes, trying to push down the thoughts that had been eating at me all day. Then I heard footsteps. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Malik stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved into his pockets, his body relaxed like he had all the time in the world. Long day, he said. I nodded, taking another sip. Yeah. Silence stretched between us, the kind that carried weight. Malik stepped closer, stopping just beside me. The warmth of his body so close sent a shiver through me. I should have moved, should have put distance between us, but I didn't. His voice was low, smooth. You ever stop fighting yourself, boss? I swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about. A soft chuckle. Yeah, you do. The air was thick, charged with something unspoken. Then, before I could stop him, before I could think, he reached out. His fingers brushed my wrist, a light, fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through me so strong I nearly dropped the bottle in my hand. My breath hitched, my pulse roaring in my ears. Malik didn't move, didn't say a word, just waited. And then, without thinking, without stopping myself, I turned to him. My breath unsteady, my body betraying everything I thought I knew about myself. Malik didn't move. He just waited, his dark eyes locked onto mine, daring me to take that final step. I could feel the heat between us, the tension that had been building for days. My fingers twitched at my side. I should have walked away. I should have ended this before it even started. But I didn't. He reached out again, this time firmer, his fingers closing around my wrist, pulling me just enough that our bodies nearly touched. My pulse pounded. He was giving me a choice, a way out. I didn't take it. And then his lips were on mine. The kiss was slow, deliberate, as if he wanted me to feel everything. And I did. Every nerve in my body came alive. Every wall I had built over the years crumbling with the press of his mouth against mine. I let out a shaky breath as he pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine. You still want to pretend? He murmured. I swallowed hard, my hands gripping his shirt before I could think twice. Not anymore. Malik's smirk returned, but this time there was something deeper in his eyes. Good. And just like that, there was no more hesitation. The rest of the world disappeared, the weight of everything I had been holding back crashing down in a single moment. There was no going back. And I didn't want to. If this story kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications. Share it with someone who loves intense and passionate stories, and let's dive into this journey together.
Sometimes life takes us on paths we never expected. A man who spent his whole life following the rules, hiding from himself, suddenly faced with a truth he could no longer deny. What started as tension, as glances that lasted too long, as unspoken words, turned into something undeniable. Malik wasn't just another worker. He was the storm that shattered everything Carter thought he knew about himself. And when that moment came, when the last wall crumbled, there was no going back. This is what it means to truly discover yourself. To stop fighting, to stop pretending, and to finally let go. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something deep inside, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Because sometimes, the biggest revelations come when we least expect them. And when they do, we have to be brave enough to accept them.